Hello and welcome to Talking Music. My name's Paul, and on this channel we like to get behind the music because every song has a story, and we look for interesting facts and information and stories and even secrets about the song. And the song we're featuring today is this from Otis Redding, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. Is this the song that has the most famous piece of whistling in music, do you think? With the possible exception of a Walt Disney or two, I'd say yes. Otis Redding is one of the most lauded artists in music for his incredible voice, which could be raw, pulsating and steamy, and at other times emotional and tender. I suppose to sum up his voice in one word, you'd have to say soul. Otis was one of those artists who always had ideas on the go. He'd multitask, as it were, with writing songs and creating ideas. And that's why his friend and co-writer Steve Cropper was absolutely vital in the Otis Redding story, because he'd take those ideas to completion. Otis was on tour with the Bar-Kays in August 1967 and had finished his acclaimed set at the Monterey Music Festival and was staying on a houseboat at Waldo Point, Sausalito, San Francisco in California. This was when he got the idea for Dock of the Bay. The first lines he actually wrote for the song were, "Watching the ships roll in, then I watched them roll away again." He was writing about what he saw, and what he saw were the ferries sailing up and down the bay, ferrying passengers. Even though they were the first lines he wrote, they became the third and fourth lines of the song. He'd write his ideas down on just about anything he could find, napkins, hotel paper, and he'd write down lyrics and song titles and riffs, and he'd carry them round with him. Otis met Steve Cropper, the record producer, guitarist, and member of Booker T and the MGs, the house band for Stax Records, when he seized an opportunity to audition for Stax Records. And it was Steve and the band who heard him, and they were absolutely wowed by his vocals. Here's how Steve remembers that first meeting.
Well, the way it came about, we were actually in the studio recording an artist named Johnny Jenkins, guitar player, left-handed guitar player. And I think at that time, Johnny had just come off of a hit record called Love Twist, the hit instrumental. And Joe Gawkin from Atlanta had called and said, "We want to bring Johnny into Stax and see if you guys can, come up with another record for him." Well, it so happened that Otis, at the time, was sort of Johnny's driver and sort of set up the band, and then he would, I guess on the gigs, I never got to see any of those gigs, but I heard stories about it. And he would naturally go up and sing some numbers, but he was sort of like the driver road guy. And so we were at the end of the date, and most of the guys, I think, had gone home. And so Al Jackson, the drummer Al Jackson, came to me and he said, "Hey," he said, "this guy out here's been bugging me all day long about, he'd like for us to hear some of his songs or something." And he said, "We ought to take a minute and listen to this guy. He sounds, pretty honest." So we said, "Okay." So he comes down to the piano there and he starts singing "These Arms of Mine," and we just went immediately. We said, "This is it. This is what we've been looking for." So we grabbed Jim Stewart and said, "Hey, you got to hear this guy. Come on out." And he heard him, said the same thing. Jim said, "Boy, we got to record this." He said, "Well, get the guys back in here and let's put one of these things down." I said, "Well, half the guys have gone." So we just sort of piecemealed what band we had there, and I wound up playing triplets on the piano, and Johnny Jenkins played guitar, and Al Jackson, and I think Louis Steinberg at that time was playing bass with him. And there it was.
The relationship between Steve and Otis grew, and they worked on a lot of songs together. And like all collaborations, each partner got used to a way of working with the other. Otis with his box full of ideas, and Steve writing lyrics that was sometimes about Otis himself. The formula they fell into was Otis would start it all off, and Steve would normally finish it.
Otis was one of those type of people that really walked around with a guitar full or a handful or a suitcase full of songs. He always had 10, 12, whatever, how many ideas running around of unfinished things. And usually when he came to town, it was a very short stay. I mean, it was never longer than like a couple of weeks. So we really had to burn the midnight oil, so to speak, in the first 2 or 3 days he was here. And I just he'd throw this at me and I'd throw something at him that I'd been doing. And we just sort of together collaborated on certain ideas, and I just sort of picked the best of it. And I think, of course, I was very fortunate to be working with somebody like Otis Redding, who was so talented, but he really influenced me. And the funny thing that every time I look back on it, I used to write, if anybody ever listens to the songs themselves, a lot of those songs that we wrote together, I used to write about him, you know. Little things, like, you know, just like in Dock of the Bay, I left my home in Georgia. Well, he did. But when he sang those songs like Mr. Pitiful and all that, I don't think he consciously was aware that he was singing about himself, because I never told him I was, you know, writing about him. He just sort of went through the motions, you know. He was just so full of music and everything. He put the same energy level in every song, whether it was a ballad or whether it was a fast up-tempo dance song. It was always the same Otis Redding, you know, which was really neat.
Together they completed Dock of the Bay when Otis flew into town and met up with Steve at Stax Records in Memphis to start making music. On this occasion, he said what he'd always said to Steve: "I've got a hit." The lyrics still needed to be finished off. It was short a second verse and a bridge, but they were finished off that evening. The song's lyrics had taken on a melancholic tone of a man who was reaching a crossroads in life. Steve penned the second verse, which was about Otis. "I left my home in Georgia, headed for the Frisco Bay." And that's what he'd actually done. He'd gone out to San Francisco to perform and then spend time on a houseboat. The end of the song contains the famous whistling sequence. Otis fans were well aware of his ad-libbing at the end of songs during the fade-out. They were usually spontaneous, and up until now had worked really well. With Dock of the Bay, the mood was such that a usual Otis ad-lib out wouldn't necessarily work. He didn't really have anything to ad-lib with, but the great man surprised everyone by whistling. This recording took place on November the 22nd, 1967. As you can hear, his first take on the whistling didn't really go down too well.
Oh.
Okay. You're not gonna make it as a whistler.
They finally got it though, but Otis was never 100% happy with the whistling and said that he'd work on something different, a fade rap of sorts, when he returned to the studio a fortnight later. There was a feeling, especially from Otis, that the song was too lightweight, too much of a pop song, and gospel singers were considered, particularly the staple singers, to give the song more soul. Steve was happy though, because he said there were some adjustments he could make in post-production. Otis didn't make that studio session on December the 7th. He was touring, so Steve spent the afternoon alone in the studio and put in some overdubs, which included electric guitar. Otis never got to hear the finished version with the guitar. On December 10th, his charter plane crashed into Lake Monona, Wisconsin. 4 members of the Bar-Kays and the pilot died. 2 days later, Steve Cropper mixed Dock of the Bay at Stax Studios, Memphis. He added the sound of seagulls and waves crashing in the background, just as Otis had requested after staying on that houseboat earlier that summer in Waldo Point and recalling those sounds. The song became the first posthumous #1 on the Billboard chart. The album, Dock of the Bay, also became the first posthumous album to top the UK Albums chart. Otis was just 26 years old when he died, and was just breaking into the mainstream white American market after his electrifying performance at the Monterey Festival that summer, where he had involved the audience in a way no other act had. He made the audience part of his performance. He was beginning to get the nickname, the King of Soul. Musicians like Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix were captivated by him. It seems he was just one song away from superstardom, and that song was coming, though he'd never get to know it. This was Sitting on the Dock of the Bay's chart performance. First the American Billboard chart, and it went to #1 March 16th, 1968. It's hard to believe, but this was his first US hit single, and it was going to be his last. It sold 1 million, it turned gold, and ended up being the 4th bestseller of 1968 in the States. The Beatles' Hey Jude was the best. And it went on to achieve worldwide sales of 4 million. Otis had found the American market up until now harder to crack than the European and British market. On the UK chart, he got as high as number 3 with Dock of the Bay. On March the 30th, 1968, it stayed in the top 5 for 6 weeks. And he'd had hits before in the UK, going back to 1966 with My Girl, and a number of songs that had hit the top 40, but all in the lower end of the top 40. This was his first top 10 hit, and again, like America, his last. Otis Redding's albums from previous years sold well posthumously in the UK this year, making Otis the second best-selling male vocalist in the UK after Tom Jones for 1968. Dock of the Bay won 2 Grammys in 1968, Best R&B Performance and Best R&B Song for writers Otis Redding and Steve Cropper, and it ranked as high as 28 on Rolling Stone's Top 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. Booker T and the MGs found out about the tragic news at Indiana Airport when their flight was delayed because of the weather. They returned to Memphis, where Steve did the final mix for release. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Otis's body hadn't even been recovered from the lake when the song was completed. But it remains Otis Redding's greatest legacy, and the whistling remained intact. When the body was recovered, Otis was found in the front passenger seat, still strapped in. 4,500 people attended his funeral on December the 18th, which took place at the City Auditorium in Macon, Georgia. After his death, more Otis Redding material was released, and his music and the magic in his voice inspired the biggest names in rock, pop, and soul. The Beatles, the Stones, Aretha Franklin, Led Zeppelin, The Doors, Janis Joplin, Marvin Gaye, everyone really. Marvin Gaye went on record saying he envied the gritty sound to Otis's voice.
The one song that I was so convinced, I said when we wrote it, I said this is a #1 record, and that was Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, for sure. But no, there are times when you definitely get some sort of inside magic feeling. I mean, it just, your hair stands up on your arm and you go, that's it, you know. I think that connection is, you're convinced that that's what's going to hit the masses. That's what's going to hit, you know, the person out there that actually listens to music and lives, you know, for the next kind of hit to inspire them and so forth. You kind of know that when you've been in the business a long time.
His star was on the inevitable rise when his life was cut short. Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, Otis Redding. And that's it for this talking music video, where every song has a story. Do subscribe to the channel. There's lots more to view on some of the world's best-known songs, where we get behind the music with facts, information, secrets, and stories. Just click on the subscribe button, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Till then, bye-bye.